Book of Nehemiah. Nehemiah. Remember now, Nehemiah. Who was Nehemiah? Right? He's the cupbearer to the king. His duty station was in the palace at Shushan. And that was a Persian, Medo-Persian king, okay, that allowed him to go back. But remember the process now. And I remember the word written up here. I don't know if you can see it or not, but I've got this word written up here. It's important to see this word behind all the scenes. This is providence. Providence. What is providence? I remember, you need to write this down if you don't have it in your Bible. Providence is the active will of God in the affairs of men. The active will of God in the affairs of men. What's that mean? God's in our business. Okay? He's all about our business. And his business is to lead us and direct us to accomplish his will. Now, Nehemiah had been placed, not by accident, not by luck, or fate, or chance. God had placed Nehemiah in this position, in the court, in the high court, as a cupbearer for the king. And during the years that he was there in captivity, he had developed a close relationship with the king and the queen. And the king and the queen saw one day that he was sad because he had received the news that his country and his countrymen and the condition of Jerusalem, the city, was bad. There was great affliction and great reproach on the city and the people. Now recall that 10 years prior to Nehemiah answering the call to God, Ezra had gone forth and had began to work in Jerusalem, rebuilding the temple. And he could not accomplish all the work because of all of the aggression and affliction that the enemies were performing upon them. Remember now, the gates are burnt down, the walls are torn down. What kind of protection would the citizens have in the city? Hardly any. I mean, you could hide behind a rock, but still they would have very little protection if a raiding party or somebody happened to come along and take a few shots at you. They'd get you because you didn't have any type of defenses. So they're in a bad, poor condition, and this is reported to Nehemiah. And Nehemiah, remember now, in chapter 1, we saw where he began to fast and mourn. Verse 4, it says, "And it came to pass, when I heard these words, that I sat down and wept, and mourned certain days, and fasted and prayed before the God of heaven." Nehemiah took it serious. And he did what anybody should do when it comes to bad news or difficult news or challenges in our spiritual life. He sat down and he prayed, he wept, he took it serious, and he went to God fasting and praying and seeking God, what God would have him to do. And of course, God gave him leadership and guidance on what he was supposed to do and how he was supposed to do it. Because in chapter 2, where we're at, we see that Artaxerxes was the king, and that Nehemiah was the cupbearer. But Nehemiah, remember now, he'd been mourning and fasting and praying. How would his appearance be? What would you look like after you cried a while? Your face would be all red and swollen, your eyes reddish and all that kind of thing. Well, that's how he appeared when he began to come into the throne room and began to serve the king his food and his wine. He had this appearance, and the king saw it right off. Now remember, Nehemiah was a very important person to the king. Why? Right. He was the taster. Okay? He was the cupbearer. He made sure that when he poured that wine, that he sipped it, he tasted it, and then he would give it to the king. So if your cupbearer gets sick all of a sudden, don't you think that'd get your attention? Because remember, back in the day, that was how they got rid of you. They'd poison you in your food or your wine. So if the cupbearer gets all of a sudden looks sick, boy, that's cause for concern. So Artaxerxes said, hey, what's going on with you? It doesn't look like you're sick. This looks like your heart's sick, that something's bothering you within. And he's a good king because he can see what's going on with Nehemiah. So then God gives Nehemiah the strength and the courage to go in and talk to the king and ask the king for permission to go. Now we've got down to verse number, let's go back to verse 15 and start from there. Chapter 2, verse 15. Then went I up in the night by the brook. Now what he's saying is, when he got to Jerusalem, the first thing he did was not to go and have a big parade, to have a big politician dinner, and all those things. It says he went to bed like he was going to go to sleep. And when everybody else was asleep, he got up. It says, then I went up in the night by the brook and viewed the wall and turned back and entered by the gate of the valley and so returned. So what did he do? Right. He went and assessed the wall and the gate with his own two eyes. Now, what's the best way to handle something? To go look and see and know for yourself what needs to be done. Now, if you take a report and say, well, there's a couple of blocks here and a couple of blocks over there that's missing, we could do this and we could do that, you don't know what it looks like by that description. But having gone and looked with his own eyes to see exactly what needed to be done, and he took a couple others with him to help him to keep notes and to keep track of what it would take, how many stones it would take, how high it needed to be, how wide it needed to be. All the little details and measurements, they all went out with him and took out these measurements and inventories and surveyed the whole job. Basically, is what you have to do. Now, anybody ever built a building? Anybody ever laid a foundation? What's the first thing that you have to do after you've got the foundation poured and you want to start building? What do you have to do? Anybody know? What's next? You have to set the corner. Okay, that's called the chief cornerstone, where you start and you lay out the square or whatever type of building you're building. You have to lay it out, and it takes a surveying tool to lay the corner out so that it's square. If the corner's not square, what happens? Ain't nothing square. The rest of it will be catty-cornered. So it has to be straight in line that way, and it has to be straight in line that way, and that way, and that way. All four corners have to line up. And if you don't get that right, the rest of it won't be lined up. And you'll find that's a real pain trying to trim them little corners, trying to get it to match up. So you have to survey it, to look at it and understand it's got to be just right. And what Nehemiah has to do in order to get an idea in his head what's got to be done and how to do it, he has to go look at it personally, make sure he's got an understanding of what needs to be done, and then he comes back. Now in verse 16 is where we left off, and it says, and the rulers knew not whither I went or what I did. So what's he saying here? He was using discretion, wasn't he? Nobody except the men with him knew what he was doing. He hadn't revealed his heart to them yet. He hadn't gotten the leaders together yet. And that's probably a good thing. Okay? He wanted to know what the job would be before he gets into the politics of getting everybody together. He wanted to know what it would take to get this job done, how many men, how many days, how many supplies, etc., before he got the leaders together. And he didn't tell anybody why it was there. So he says, and the rulers knew not whither I went or what I did, neither had I as yet told it to the Jews, nor to the priests, nor to the nobles, nor to the rulers, nor to the rest that did the work. He hadn't even told the bricklayers and the carpenters anything yet either. Okay? So he's holding his cards close to his vest. Now that's important too. He's using discretion because God had sent him there, and he had to be cautious because the enemy was about to. And you'll see all through the book of Nehemiah where that enemy is always around lurking. And we saw that where the enemy was there. Let's go back a minute and go back to verse number 10, chapter 2, verse 10. It says, when Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the servant, the Ammonite, heard of it, it grieved them exceedingly that there was come a man to seek the welfare of the children of Israel. They didn't like that, did they? Because they had been the ones that were keeping Israel under reproach, under affliction, and hardship. They were making sure Israel didn't prosper. And here comes a man sent by God, by God's providence, sent to fix this condition. Boy, they were upset. And you'll see him mentioned again that in verse 19 when we get down there. All right? He said, then I said unto them. Okay? I said unto them. Who are the them? Verse 17. Then I said unto them. Nope. He's finally got around to talking to the rulers. He calls an assembly. And when he says rulers, you see all those that are mentioned there in verse 16. The noblemen, the governors, the priests, everybody. He's got all of the leadership that are around together in a conference now. It says, then said I unto them, ye see the distress that we are in, how Jerusalem lieth waste, and the gates thereof are burned with fire. Now, is that not a fair assessment of the condition? All right, now go back to chapter 1 again, and look and see what the men told him in verse 3, chapter 1, verse 3. Remember what the report was that he received that caused him to mourn and weep? Look what it says. And they said unto me, the remnant that are left of the captivity there in the province are in great affliction and reproach. The wall of Jerusalem also is broken down, and the gates thereof are burned with fire. So what does he do in verse 17 now? He's given the same report that he received, didn't he? But he hadn't seen that in chapter 1. Now he's physically seen it with his own eyes, and he received that description and used that same description to describe it to the leadership there in Israel, in Jerusalem. So he's given you an accurate statement. He's given the leadership a true report of what and where and how exactly they are and what's going to have to be done. Look what he says now next. He says, come. Now, what's that mean? Come. Come on. Lee, we got something to do. He says, come and let us build up the wall of Jerusalem, that we be no more a reproach. Now look at that. Come, let us rebuild. Now, remember, Nehemiah is not a politician, although he's been in the court. Okay? He's a layman. He knows how to get things done. He knows how to accomplish projects. He's got out and he's evaluated the project. He's gone out, he's got the details that it's going to take to do it. He's not talked to anybody, but now he calls for the leadership and says, come. This is what I'm here for. Let's get together and let's build this walls. Because without them walls, there would always be a reproach to every enemy that come by. Without them walls, they had very little protection. And you think about it, what was the key back then in the day when they had walls? What were those walls for? Right, protection, defense, for guard, all those things. Walls were very useful in slowing the enemy down long enough for you to mount a defense. They would have watchmen on the walls watching for the enemy, and they would sound the alarm. So Nehemiah says, now let's get together, come, and let's rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. All right, and look what he says now. It says that we be no more a reproach. Okay, a reproach means that that the enemies were hating them. Now that's not going to change very much, is it? The enemy's always going to hate them, but they won't have the ability to just tear them down anytime they take a notion. They won't have the ability to attack them anytime they feel like it. That all of those little tactics that they were employing before would no longer work when they had the walls completed. So Nehemiah gets the leadership and says, hey, let us build this wall. Direct, to the point. He doesn't say, oh, good Lord this, good governor this, or good prince this, or any of those things. He said, let's build the wall. So, God has moved Nehemiah to be a leader among leaders. Now, the leadership that was in Jerusalem hadn't accomplished very much at all except for the temple getting started building. And that would take a long time to finish. But the leadership hadn't gotten together enough to go ahead and build the wall. And these other two guys that were hindering them, they were keeping them from doing anything like that. So it took God raising up a man by his providence in the court of the king Artaxerxes and raising him up there to get what needed to be gotten to get to Jerusalem and to be able to set up the walls once again. And you'll find again that in chapter 2, that 70 weeks of Daniel starts there from the day that Nehemiah left to go to Jerusalem to see what needed to be done. All right? Now look what he says. Then said I unto them, ye see the distress that we are in. Notice he says we. He's including himself. How Jerusalem lieth waste, and the gates thereof are burned with fire. Come and let us build up the wall of Jerusalem, that we be no more a reproach. Now look at verse 18. Then I told them of the hand of my God, which was good upon me, as also the king's words, and also the king's words that he had spoken unto me. And they said, no. They said, let us rise up and build. Now, Nehemiah might have seemed to the leadership like a Johnny-come-lately, a flash in the pan, a politician, those kind of things. But notice, he's not playing games. He wasn't seeking a parade, a ticker tape parade down Main Street. He's not looking for fame or glory. He says we and us. He includes himself with them because he is a Jew. And God has given him that burden to do what he needed to do. And he shares that burden with the leadership. And what do they say? Let us rise up and what? That's a matter of fact, isn't it? They saw him as a leader of leaders. They saw him as a man that had a purpose to do something. They saw in him the hand of God moving him to them. And the hand of God moving to restore Jerusalem once again. So he said, let us rise and build. It's time we got started. Now notice this. He said, so they strengthened their hands for this good work. Now, what does that mean? Strengthen their hands. What do you think that means? All right, let's say you try to pick up a sword. All right, and you pick up that sword and you draw it out. Now, what happens if you haven't exercised that hand or that arm? What's your sword going to do? You got to have muscles. You got to have strength. And you have to have the determination and the courage to do it. And that's what that means. By strengthening their hands, they determined to take up the cause. They determined to fight the enemy. If they came and attacked them, they were going to do it anyway. God gave them the courage to take up the project. So you see, providence has given Nehemiah courage. Providence has brought him back to Jerusalem. And providence now, in his leadership, has stirred the hearts of the men because he told them how God's hand was upon him and how the king had granted his every request. And that the king desired this good work to be done. And that gave them encouragement. That gave them the fortitude, the courage that they needed so that they could begin this project knowing that they had God on their side again. Now, what had happened to have all them walls torn down and the gate burned? What had caused that? What had caused the gates and the walls to be torn down? Right. They had turned their back on God. They had rejected God. And sin cost them that city. And they got carried off into Babylonian captivity for 70 years. 70 years is what it cost them for that sin and those sins. Now, God, though, when he told them through Isaiah and Ezekiel, Jeremiah, and Daniel, God told them that he was going to bring them back home. And all of a sudden, here's Nehemiah now, presenting to them that God's hand was upon him and showing them what God had already worked. Here now, they've been encouraged to begin the work like they should be doing. That God's helping, God's blessing, God's moving once again to get them back to where they could and should be. So remember this, if God's moving you in a direction, do what God would have you to do, but do it in the right way. Seek God first, pour out your heart to God and see what God would have you to do. And then do what God moves you to do. And God will direct you, God will keep you, and God will help you do what needs to be done. So far, it's just a miracle in itself that the king had it in his heart to help him. It's a miracle in itself that Nehemiah got there safely. Now, you know how the enemy's out there, but he got a guard from the king that escorted him all the way from Shushan to Jerusalem. He got an accompaniment of captains and horsemen. And he had letters in his pocket from the king that the governors would have to escort him safely through the provinces so that he could make it. And he made it there safely. Why? Providence had brought him there. And providence was going to ensure, God's will was going to ensure that he accomplished what God had set in his heart to do. So Nehemiah had it in his heart to do it. He challenged the leadership, and leadership, okay, let's rise up and let's build. Because they knew God was moving. They saw it in Nehemiah, and now they've taken the courage, and they're going to begin building. Now, what's going to be the first thing when you determine to do something good for God? What's going to happen next? Right. The devil's going to raise up. Opposition's going to come. So we'll start there next time in verse 19 and look at what the enemy tries to do. Okay? And remember now, the enemy doesn't give up. All through the book of Nehemiah, you'll see them trying to do things. They even want to assassinate Nehemiah. Okay? But God kept him safe, and God was preserving him and watching over him the whole time that he was getting this work done. And God will watch over us and do the same thing for us in any situation that we face if we'll just rely on Him, seek His will, His way, and then go to it. God will help us. All right, we'll stop there. Let's all stand.